What if Jesus left behind a message so powerful, so quietly revolutionary, that it had to be buried literally, not just forgotten, not just rejected, hidden? A text more poetic than Paul, more subversive than John. A gospel not meant to be read aloud in churches, but whispered in secret among those who saw the world differently. It wasn't called the Gospel of Truth by its authors. That name came later, after the dirt was brushed away, after someone somewhere cracked open a jar beneath the Egyptian sands, and history shifted, just a little. But for now, let the sense of urgency soften. You've heard the whisper, now breathe it in. The pages aren't going anywhere. Let the desert wind settle. Let the candlelight flicker. We are about to turn to a gospel not of commandments, but of clues. Not of thunder, but of silence. You didn't come for noise, you came for meaning. In 1945, near a sleepy village in Upper Egypt, a farmer named Muhammad Ali, no, not that one was searching for fertilizer. He struck something hard, not treasure, not bones, clay jars, sealed. Inside, papyrus manuscripts carefully wrapped in leather and linen. They didn't shine. They didn't shimmer. But within them lay some of the most mysterious Christian writings ever discovered. Among them was a work unlike anything else, a poetic meditation, dense and strange, filled with riddles and revelations. It would take decades before it was translated, let alone understood. But once it was, one phrase stood out from the page: the gospel of truth. Not a gospel. The gospel. As if all others were commentary. The text didn't tell the story of Jesus in any traditional sense. No birth in Bethlehem. No feeding of the 5,000. No triumphant entry, no cross. Instead, it whispered of forgetting and remembering. Of a world spun out of ignorance and a divine truth trying to call it home. Scholars linked it to a man named Valentinus, a brilliant Christian thinker, once almost elected Bishop of Rome before his ideas were deemed too dangerous to survive. This was not a gospel about what Jesus did. It was about what he meant. What he revealed, not through miracles or parables, but through the very act of remembering who you really are. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The jar didn't look like much. Bulging at the neck, sun-baked and sealed with pitch, it could have held oil grain or ashes. But it held something stranger, a bundle of leather-bound codices buried just outside the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif. You imagine the farmer's hesitation. This was 1945 and magic still lingered in the Egyptian soil. Curses weren't punchlines, they were real. And when a man opens something ancient and unknown, his first fear isn't archaeological, it's spiritual. But the jar cracked, the contents removed, and within days, pages once read by early Christians, then banned, burned, and forgotten, were back in human hands. The Gospel of Truth was one of them. Not titled as such in the manuscript, but soon identified by scholars primarily due to a single reference by Irenaeus, the 2nd century bishop, who really had it in for heretics. He accused Valentinus and his followers of circulating a dangerous document called the Gospel of Truth, a work so subversive, so poetic, that it threatened to blur the boundaries between knowledge and salvation, between Christ and consciousness. This alone was a historical breakthrough. For centuries, this gospel was nothing more than a ghost in the writings of its enemies. Irenaeus mentioned it briefly in Against Heresies, which was basically the Yelp review nobody asked for but everyone read. He didn't quote it. He didn't analyze it. He simply condemned it, and that was enough to keep it lost. Until, like some theological time capsule, it was found again in the Nag Hammadi library. The fact of its rediscovery is not in dispute. 11 leather codices containing 52 texts, many of them previously unknown, were found in a red hill near Nag Hammadi. This is the historical anchor, the non-negotiable reality around which everything else orbits. But what makes this moment so tantalizing isn't just the what or the where, it's the why. Why were these texts hidden? Why sealed in jars and buried, and why did they survive so completely untouched by centuries of censorship? Here's where the scholarly debates open up like one of those crumbling codices. Some argue that monks from the nearby Pachomian monastery hid the texts during a 4th century purge of non-canonical writings. Others suggest a more mundane theory that it was a private stash hidden for safekeeping by a scribe sympathetic to Gnostic views. But in both theories, fear is the constant. Fear of loss, fear of heresy, fear of forgetting. And speaking of forgetting, remember that the gospel of truth will return to this theme again and again. In fact, it treats forgetfulness not just as a human flaw, but as the very problem Christ came to solve. It doesn't begin with sin. It begins with amnesia, a cosmic forgetting of who we are, where we came from, and what binds us to the divine. The controversial detail here is the jar itself. Some accounts claim it was shattered during a fight between the farmer and his brothers over the division of spoils. Others say it was deliberately broken by the mother fearing evil spirits. One version includes the murder of a man named Ahmed Ismail, whose blood was allegedly spilled over the manuscripts, imbuing them with a cursed reputation before scholars ever touched them. These tales straddle the line between fact and folklore, but in stories like this, folklore is part of the fact. And let's not pretend all scholars are happy about what was found. The language of the gospel of truth is frustratingly abstract. Unlike the 4 canonical gospels, it doesn't tell a linear story. It reads more like a riddle wrapped in incense smoke. One professor famously referred to it as a theological jazz solo. Others praised its beauty, even as they admitted they had no idea what parts of it meant. That's the thing with ancient mysticism, it's either profound or pretentious, and often both by the same paragraph. Still, the text breathes, not just because it survived, but because it pulses with questions no creed can answer. Who are we beneath our masks? What did Jesus really try to show us? And if truth is something remembered, not taught, then what are we forgetting right now? You might recall from our introduction how this gospel never refers to itself by name. That anonymity has become part of its mystique. It doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't shout its credentials. Like a message slipped under a door, it waits for you to find it when you're ready. That's how it begins. Not with trumpets, with silence. Not with commandments, with riddles. And not with doctrine, but with a story buried beneath a hill cracked open by accident and read aloud again after 17 centuries of dust. And it won't be the last time a forgotten gospel changes everything. You've heard the word before. Gnostic. It sounds esoteric, slippery, something whispered behind temple curtains or muttered in smoky cafes by people wearing too many rings. But in the world of early Christianity, the term was more than a label. It was a provocation. The name comes from the Greek gnosis, meaning knowledge, not the kind found in scrolls or sermons, but a personal, intimate understanding, a remembering, not a learning. The Gnostics didn't believe salvation came through belief in a doctrine or obedience to a church. They believed you had to wake up, not just follow Christ, but remember what He awakened in you. In this, they weren't trying to be edgy. They were trying to survive a world they believed had been built on a cosmic misunderstanding. And here's the historical anchor: the Gnostics weren't a single group, but a diverse collection of early Christian movements that flourished during the first few centuries of the Common Era. They appeared across Egypt, Syria, Rome, and Asia Minor like theological wildflowers blooming outside the manicured garden of orthodoxy. Some were ascetic, retreating from the world. Others embraced complex myths filled with archons, aeons, and unknowable realms. They wrote prolifically. They debated fiercely. And they were united not by uniform beliefs, but by a shared sense that the world as it appeared was not the world as it truly was. That's the unnerving part, isn't it? The Gnostics didn't say the world was bad, they said it was broken. Worse, it was a counterfeit. Created by a lower being, an ignorant or malevolent demiurge who mistook themselves for God. And in this world of illusion, souls had forgotten their origin, their divine spark, their true home. Enter Christ, not as a sacrifice to appease this lower God, but as a revealer, a memory trigger, a kind of cosmic therapist, saying, hey, you forgot who you were. Let me remind you. Controversial, absolutely. Heretical according to the bishops, yes. But pause before passing judgment. The Gnostics weren't anti-Jesus. They were just allergic to simplicity. For them, the idea that Jesus came to die so God could forgive sins was not only too neat, it was missing the point. They saw the crucifixion not as the climax of the story, but a tragic misunderstanding. The real revelation was Jesus' message, not his death. And that brings us back to the gospel of truth. This text doesn't preach repentance. It doesn't warn of hell. It whispers about forgetfulness, like a parent trying to wake a sleeping child without scaring them. It speaks in metaphors about harmony, lost knowledge hidden, and memory as salvation. That poetic tone isn't just stylistic. It's intentional. Gnostic texts often embraced paradox and poetry because they believed truth couldn't be handed to you like a spoonful of doctrine. It had to be felt, recalled, unearthed from within. Now for the obscure detail, one you rarely find in church history classes. Some Gnostic groups believed Jesus laughed at the crucifixion. Not out of cruelty, but because he knew it wasn't real, that the body on the cross wasn't truly him, that the real Christ had already transcended the illusion. In the second treatise of the Great Seth, another text from the Nag Hammadi library, Christ says, "I did not die in reality, but in appearance." Try bringing that up during Easter service. And here's the scholarly debate: were the Gnostics Christians at all? Some say yes, that they represent an authentic early strand of Christian thought that just got outvoted. Others argue they were outsiders who co-opted Christian language for their own mystical philosophy. But recent scholarship has complicated that binary. Many now believe that the early Jesus movement was far more diverse than the later church wanted to admit. That what we call heresy might just be history we didn't canonize. You might recall from the last section how the gospel of truth lacks a clear narrative structure. That's not a bug, it's a feature. Gnosticism isn't about chronology, it's about awakening, the kind that doesn't happen in a single moment, but creeps in like dawn behind closed eyelids. And maybe that's why they were suppressed. The early bishops didn't just dislike the Gnostics, they feared them. Because a religion built on authority can't abide people claiming direct access to the divine. That's theological anarchy. If everyone carries a divine spark and doesn't need a priest to light it, then what happens to the priest? But the Gnostics didn't leave manifestos. They left riddles. They didn't argue in court, they disappeared into caves. They didn't win, but they endured. In scraps and fragments, in jars buried beneath Egyptian cliffs, in texts that once burned but now glow on the screens of scholars and seekers alike, and in the pages of the gospel of truth, their vision of Christ still lingers, gentle, mysterious, half-smiling. less a king on a throne than a whisper in your memory reminding you of something you once knew and then forgot. Imagine being so brilliant, so persuasive, that the early church almost made you pope and then decided you were too dangerous to exist. That's Valentinus. He wasn't a cartoon villain or a fringe mystic lurking in caves. He was a towering intellectual figure of the 2nd century, a Christian teacher, whose influence spanned Rome, Alexandria, and beyond. And if the gospel of truth bears any author's fingerprints, they're his. Let's begin with what's historically firm. Valentinus was born around 100 CE, likely in Egypt, and educated in Alexandria, a city that functioned like the Wi-Fi of the ancient world, chaotic, overloaded, but also weirdly enlightening. He studied under Theudas, who was supposedly a disciple of Paul. Whether that's fact or legend, the connection placed Valentinus close to apostolic roots, close enough to make his ideas feel not just radical, but authorized. And what ideas they were. Valentinus believed that creation began with a pure, unknowable source, the pleroma, or fullness, from which emanated a cascade of divine entities called aeons. One of these, Sophia or wisdom, yearned to know the unknowable source, and in doing so caused a rift, a misstep, that birthed the flawed creator of the material world. Yes, in his theology, the God of Genesis wasn't the top of the divine ladder, just an administrator with boundary issues. It was daring, theologically volcanic, but it wasn't aimless. Valentinus wasn't tearing down Christianity. He was offering a more mystical scaffolding, a mythic structure in which Christ comes not to atone for sin, but to restore memory, to awaken the divine spark exiled in flesh. His Jesus didn't die for your sins. He came to dismantle the ignorance that made you think you were separate from the divine in the first place. This cosmology wasn't fringe during his time. It was wildly popular. For a while, Valentinus was the toast of Christian Rome. According to Tertullian, another church father who never missed an opportunity to grumble, Valentinus nearly became Bishop of Rome. But when he was passed over, his teachings grew more symbolic, more abstract. You can practically hear Tertullian's eye-roll echo through the centuries. And here's the obscure detail that most people miss. Valentinus wasn't trying to start a new religion. He thought he was preserving Christianity's deeper meaning. There are no Valentinian temples, no altars, no separate gospel attributed to him by name. The gospel of truth, for example, never signs off with Love Val. But stylistically and theologically, it pulses with his ideas, the poetry, the emphasis on interior awakening, the disdain for ignorance masquerading as authority. All of it matches. This leads us to the scholarly debate. Did Valentinus actually write the Gospel of Truth? Some say yes, that it's his lost masterpiece finally recovered. Others argue it was composed by a later follower, part of the so-called Valentinian school. But even among skeptics, the influence is undeniable. This Gospel is Valentinian in structure, thought, and tone. Whether he authored it or not, his shadow falls across every page. You might remember from our last section how Gnostic movements emphasized direct experience over dogma. Valentinus didn't just believe that. He embodied it. His followers didn't reject the church, they just moved through it differently. They baptized, prayed, shared the Eucharist, but with a twist. For them, these rituals weren't symbolic cleansings. They were reminders. Not acts of obedience, but clues planted along the road back to divine memory. And it's this notion of memory that anchors the gospel of truth. The text doesn't call for repentance in the traditional sense. It calls for recognition. Like someone calling your name from a distance, and for a moment you remember who you are. Valentinus believed Christ wasn't a rescuer, but a revealer. Not someone who changes your status before God, but someone who helps you realize you were never separate in the first place. Here's where things get tricky. The early church wasn't particularly fond of metaphor. It liked fences, not mazes. Valentinus spoke in spirals. And while his teachings might sound peaceful to modern ears, they threatened to dissolve the authority structures the bishops were working hard to build. If salvation is internal, who needs a priest? If divine truth is a memory, who needs a creed? So Valentinus was branded a heretic. Not because he denied Christ, but because he reframed him. Not as a sacrifice to wrath, but as a light to banish forgetting. But history has a wry sense of humor. While the name of Valentinus was condemned in councils and copied into lists of heresies, the ideas he championed survived buried, wrapped in leather and sealed in jars. The gospel of truth would vanish for 1700 years. Valentinus would vanish too, reduced to footnotes in the writings of his enemies. And yet, like a dream you thought was gone, he returns. Not in his own name, but in a gospel that refuses to be forgotten. It's a strange thing to write something so profound, so intricate, so layered with meaning, and never give it a title. No flourish, no signature, no claim to authorship. Just a cascade of words that begins mid-thought like a letter started long before you found it. That's the gospel of truth. Or rather, what we call the gospel of truth. The name appears nowhere in the manuscript. No opening line like the gospel according to. No closing signature, no scribal flourish, no sincerely the Gnostics. Just silence, and then poetry. You might assume this was an oversight, but in the world of Gnostic writing, silence isn't a void. It's a strategy, a sacred one. To name something is to fix it in place, to make it static. But this gospel is liquid. It wants to slip through categories. Is it a prayer, a sermon, a meditation, a poem, masquerading as theology? Yes, and no. And something else entirely. Historically, the manuscript containing this work was catalogued as Codex Theophan, or the Jung Codex, named after Carl Jung. Yes, that Jung, whose foundation received the first translations. Inside that codex were several texts, and tucked among them was this untitled composition. Its language was elegant, dense, recursive. Phrases repeated and refracted. Ideas folded inward like origami. It didn't read like Mark or Matthew. It read like someone trying to describe a dream with the vocabulary of a theologian and the rhythm of a mystic. The title Gospel of Truth comes not from its opening line, but from a passage within the text itself, which refers to the gospel of truth as a message that brings joy to those who receive it. But is that a label for the whole work, or just a poetic phrase used in passing? Scholars debated this for years, and still do. Naming it the Gospel of Truth was more of a convenience than a discovery. It was a placeholder that stuck, like naming your cat and realizing years later that it actually suits them. And this raises a curious problem. What do you call a message that doesn't want to be labeled? What happens when the text itself resists category? Here lies the obscure detail, one that echoes the paradoxical soul of the text. In the Coptic manuscript, the punctuation is sparse, the paragraphs unmarked, and the thoughts loop back on themselves. Some scholars believe this structure was deliberate, not a sign of disorganization, but a rhetorical technique meant to disorient the reader into clarity. You don't just read the gospel of truth, you orbit it. You lose your footing in its curves and circles until the ground beneath you shifts, and only then does something click. You might recall from our previous section how Valentinus preferred metaphor to mandate. If he or his followers were behind this text, then the absence of a title fits perfectly. Naming would reduce it, flatten it, but leaving it unnamed that invites the reader to experience the text without preconceptions. It becomes not a gospel. It becomes your gospel, one that you discover, not one that declares itself. This is where the open scholarly question arises: was the gospel of truth ever meant to circulate broadly? Some scholars argue that its rhetorical style suggests it was composed for a small circle of initiates, not the general Christian public. Its complex, layering poetic phrasing and recursive structure might have been designed for meditation recitation, or even a kind of mystical performance, rather than conventional reading. Others push back, noting that the presence of the word gospel implies a public message, something meant to be shared. But even here, the term is slippery. In the canonical Gospels, Evangelion refers to the good news of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. In the Gospel of Truth, it refers to the joy that comes from remembering the divine origin of the soul. The news isn't about events, it's about awakening. Which brings us to a thought worth lingering on. What if the refusal to name the text is part of the message? What if the Gospel's very identity is meant to remain fluid, so that every reader or hearer finds something different? You don't remember something because it's labeled. You remember it because it calls to you. That's the haunting beauty of this Gospel. It doesn't assert. It echoes. It speaks in a voice already inside you, faint at first, like a melody you can't quite place. And when it refers to itself, it does so in passing, as though truth is not a brand, but a breeze. Not a creed, but a current. You might think this makes the text feel unanchored, but the opposite is true. By refusing to lock itself into a single identity, the gospel of truth becomes a mirror. It reflects not just what the author believed, but what the reader is ready to remember. No title needed. And in a world filled with books screaming for attention, one text whispering anonymously from the desert feels strangely radical. At first glance, the Gospel of Truth doesn't seem like it's trying to tell a story. There's no clear beginning, no list of characters, no rising action that builds toward a climactic miracle or moral epiphany. Instead, it moves like a dream, lush, lyrical, maddeningly elusive. Words swirl and circle back on themselves. Sentences stretch until they forget where they started. And just when you think you've grasped the point, it slips through your fingers like incense smoke. But that's the point. The Gospel of Truth doesn't want to inform you. It wants to transform you. Not through facts, but through rhythm. Not through arguments, but through poetry. You read it the way you'd listen to waves crashing at dusk, not for data, but for a kind of emotional gravity that pulls you inward. Let's start with what we know. Linguistically, the Coptic version found in the Nag Hammadi codices is a translation from a Greek original composed sometime between 140 and 180 CE. The structure is not linear, but thematic. Its phrasing echoes the cadence of psalms, mystical hymns, and even fragments of philosophical dialogues. That's the historical fact. This is a gospel that sounds more like a prayer than a proclamation. Even its metaphors repeat like refrains in a song: the Father, the name, the error, the forgetfulness, all returning in cycles like the slow revolutions of a celestial clock. And unlike the terse declarations of Paul or the journalistic tone of Luke, this gospel speaks like someone who knows words are inadequate, but keeps using them anyway, because silence, while holy, doesn't record well on parchment. Here's an obscure literary detail. Scholars have noted the use of chiasmus, a poetic technique, where ideas are presented in a mirrored structure like A, B, C, B, A. This device creates a sense of symmetry and return a kind of verbal mandala meant to draw the reader inward. You don't just follow the argument, you spiral into it, like a labyrinth that leads not out, but deeper in. One passage reads, "The gospel of truth is joy for those who have received from the Father of truth the grace of knowing him. It is the revelation of the hope. It is not put forth in words." You see what just happened. A gospel that is words telling you it's not about words. That contradiction isn't clumsy, it's intentional. The point is to make you pause, to let the weight of the idea land not in your brain, but somewhere lower, somewhere quieter. You might remember from the previous section how the lack of a formal title invites open-ended interpretation. The poetic style does something similar. It breaks the tyranny of precision. It refuses to be pinned down. If dogma is a road sign, this gospel is a fog-shrouded path lit only by fireflies. You don't know where it's going, but something in you wants to follow. This raises a central debate among scholars and readers alike. Is the text's poeticism a strength or a weakness? Detractors argue that it lacks clarity, that its meaning is obscured by language so metaphorical it borders on nonsense. Others, particularly those attuned to mystic traditions, argue that this is exactly what makes the text powerful. In their view, it's not supposed to make sense the way a manual does. It's supposed to awaken something that's already inside you. And that leads us to a curious tension. Most canonical Gospels tell you what happened. This one tells you how it feels to remember what's been lost. The words operate less like commands and more like music. And if you've ever listened to a song in a language you barely understand and still felt something you're halfway to grasping how this gospel works, even its imagery seems less drawn from earthly events and more from the architecture of the soul. The name of the Father is described not as a label, but as an experience that dwells within the knower. The lost ones don't return to a city or a garden, they return to themselves. And error, that slippery villain, is not a demon or a snake, but a kind of fog that wraps around the soul, causing it to forget where it came from. This poetic sensibility isn't just stylistic, it's theological. For the author, truth is not propositional, it's revelatory. It doesn't arrive with a trumpet blast, but with the hush of dawn. Truth isn't taught, it's remembered. Like an old lullaby your grandmother used to hum that suddenly reemerges one night as you wash dishes and you don't know why, but your eyes sting a little. This is where Valentinian influence pulses most vividly. You recall from section 4 how Valentinus emphasized inner awakening over external belief. The poetic style of this gospel reflects that inward gaze. It doesn't care if you can quote it. It only cares if it shifts something deep behind your ribs. And here's where the tone of the text becomes almost cinematic. Not in the Hollywood sense, but in the way it evokes movement without action. Phrases like the sweetness of the Father and the fragrance of truth appeal to senses rarely invoked in Scripture. This is not a gospel that tells you what to do. It tells you what it feels like to know that everything you feared is only a shadow and that love was never absent, only forgotten. So is it frustrating? Yes. Maddening sometimes. But is it beautiful? Absolutely. And that beauty isn't accidental. It's a form of theology, a theology where rhythm reveals what prose cannot, where truth isn't an answer, but a homecoming. And if you're patient, if you let the loops loop and the metaphors shimmer, something will shift. Not all at once. Not in a lightning bolt. But slowly. Softly. Like the moment you wake up and for just a second can't remember your name, but you know you're safe. So, where is he? You open the gospel of truth expecting the familiar figure, robes, sandals, a trail of miracles, maybe a parable or two, tossed like breadcrumbs across Galilee. But instead you find silence, metaphor, and a Jesus who seems to shimmer at the edges of the page more like a reflection in still water than a man walking dusty roads. He's there, of course, but he's different. This gospel doesn't mention Mary. No shepherds, no feeding of multitudes, no dramatic confrontations with Pharisees. In fact, it never calls him Jesus of Nazareth or even Jesus Christ. Instead, it refers to him obliquely, the Word, the name, the Son, the Revealer, the fragrance of the Father. It's like trying to hold light in your hands. The more you reach for him, the more you realize he's not here to be grasped. He's here to awaken something. The historical reality is clear. The Gospel of Truth reflects a very different Christology than the Synoptic Gospels. Scholars agree that its author, likely influenced by Valentinian theology, understood Jesus not primarily as a man who died for sins, but as a manifestation of divine knowledge come to reawaken the soul's memory of its origin. This wasn't a late embellishment or some medieval invention. It's a second-century document, close enough to the events of Jesus' life that echoes of that original moment still ring, but distant enough that theology has begun to bloom in wild, unfamiliar shapes. And here's the twist. This version of Jesus isn't distant or cold. He's intimate, invasive even. Not a king ruling from on high, but a whisper inside your own chest. He doesn't arrive with thunder or lightning. He arrives when you remember. Not history, but identity. One obscure but fascinating phrase in the Gospel refers to him as the fruit of the Father's heart. Not Savior, not Messiah. Fruit. Something grown, something sweet. Something meant to be tasted, not worshipped from afar. It suggests a God not thundering from a mountaintop, but quietly gesturing toward the soul and saying this: "This is my joy." You may remember from section 6 how the poetic language of the gospel operates like a spiritual atmosphere, dense, indirect, often circular. That style continues here. Jesus is never introduced. He simply emerges, as if he's not the subject of the gospel, but the substance of its revelation. He is the word that breaks the silence, not by declaring, but by reminding, not by conquering, but by being. This leads to an ongoing debate in scholarship. Was this text intentionally deconstructing the canonical image of Jesus, or was it simply drawing from a different reservoir of early Christian thought? Some argue it's a deliberate pushback, a kind of spiritual counter-gospel that avoids narrative in favor of vision. Others suggest it's simply a reflection of how diverse early Christianity really was, that there were always multiple Jesuses: the rabbi, the revolutionary, the miracle worker, and here the revealer. And what does he reveal? Not a code, not a set of rules, but a wound, a forgetting, and a way home. The gospel tells us that error, that great fog of ignorance, created the conditions for fear, shame, and self-division. But when the word appeared, error was disturbed, not destroyed, not punished, just unsettled. The presence of truth made illusion waver. Jesus then doesn't defeat sin. He dispels confusion, not with a sword, but with a sentence. And sometimes not even that. Sometimes just a presence. This Jesus doesn't do miracles. He is one. Not because he bends the world to his will, but because he reminds the world of what it forgot. One passage describes him as a sweetness that came from the Father, an experience of being known so fully, so deeply, that all the noise of the world fades. He's not the commander of angels. He's the clearing of the fog, the sudden realization that you were never alone, that the voice calling to you was always your own, returned through him. You might also recall from section 3 how some Gnostics believed the crucifixion was symbolic or even illusory. The Gospel of Truth doesn't go quite that far, but it does noticeably avoid dwelling on the cross. Instead, it presents the mission of the Word as one of restoration, not redemption. Jesus doesn't satisfy wrath. He dissolves illusion. His role isn't to change your status before God. It's to remind you that your exile was always self-imposed. There's even a sly gentleness in how the text speaks of those who still dwell in error. They're not condemned. They're sleeping. They're children lost in a game of forgetting. And Jesus is not the scolding parent, but the familiar voice in the distance calling them home. This portrayal unsettles those who prefer sharper theological boundaries. It softens judgment. It decentralizes church authority. It suggests rather mischievously that you don't need to earn your way back to God, you only need to remember you were never separated to begin with. And maybe that's why this Jesus still haunts the edges of Christian thought. Not as a rival to the Jesus of Matthew or John, but as a complement. A mirror. A Christ not crucified by Rome but forgotten by the soul and found again not on a cross but in the quiet room of your own becoming. In this gospel, Jesus doesn't say, "Follow me." He says, "Remember me." And in doing so, remember yourself. So far, you've wandered through poetic fog and mystical metaphors. You've watched Jesus transform from miracle worker to memory jogger. But what exactly is this gospel saying? What does it want from you? It doesn't ask for belief. It doesn't tell you to repent. There's no altar call, no list of sins, no looming threat of damnation. Instead, it circles a single startling idea: truth is not something taught, it is something remembered. That's the gospel's central claim. Everything else is window dressing. The gospel of truth tells you that the world is asleep, trapped in a kind of spiritual amnesia. We are not sinful in essence, we are forgetful. Lost in a fog of error, separated not from God's love, but from our awareness of it. And Jesus, He's not here to rescue you from wrath. He's here to shake you gently awake. Let's anchor this in something historically solid. In the 2nd century, debates raged across the Christian world about what salvation really was. For some, like Irenaeus, salvation came through adherence to correct doctrine and church authority. For others, like Valentinus and his followers, salvation came through gnosis, that is, intimate experiential knowledge of the divine. The gospel of truth doesn't hedge its bets. It picks a side, loudly and with poetic flair. The text refers repeatedly to the name of the Father, a mysterious phrase that has nothing to do with syllables or divine titles. It's not Yahweh, not El Shaddai, not even Abba. The name is the essence of divine identity, and the gospel insists that this name can be known not through Scripture alone, but through recognition. When you encounter it, something inside you clicks. You don't learn it. You remember it. Like a tune you've always known, but only now realize you've been humming your whole life. That's where this gospel begins to whisper its heresy. Because if knowledge of the divine is internal, then no priest, no bishop, no earthly authority controls access to it. It's already inside you, curled like a sleeping seed. That's not a comforting message to institutions trying to enforce creeds. It's spiritual anarchy. Beautiful, fragrant anarchy. And here's an obscure twist that most readers miss. In one passage, the gospel describes the Word not just as a revealer, but as something that entered into the ignorance. That's theological dynamite. It means the divine didn't just reach down to save us, it actually entered the very fog of error to guide us out. Like diving into a dream to whisper into the ear of a sleeper. It's a different kind of salvation story. Less about legal pardon, more about existential rescue. Jesus doesn't satisfy God's justice, He heals your blindness. He doesn't change God's mind, He changes your memory. You might recall from the last section how this gospel never explicitly names Jesus in the way other texts do. That's no accident. By avoiding personal details, the text universalizes the role of the revealer. It's not about Jesus, the man. It's about what flowed through him, the truth he carried, the awakening he sparked. In that sense, the gospel of truth is less interested in Jesus' biography than in your psychology. It's not a history lesson, it's a wake-up call. And here we arrive at the scholarly debate: is this text preaching universal salvation, or is it a selective invitation? Some scholars argue that its language of awakening implies a secret elite, those who are ready, who have ears to hear. Others push back, noting that the gospel seems almost gentle in its tone toward those still in error. There's no fire, no judgment, just longing. As if even those still lost are being quietly beckoned toward home. But even if the path is open to all, it's not easy. Because awakening isn't a moment, it's a process. And the gospel acknowledges this. It speaks of those who seek him and reveal him, suggesting that recognition isn't passive. It's a search. Not for something new, but for something ancient within you, buried under layers of fear, shame, and forgetfulness. This process, the gospel says, brings joy, not the fleeting dopamine jolt kind, but a deeper satisfaction, a kind of spiritual sigh, the joy of knowing you've never really been alone, that even your worst moments weren't exile, but sleep. You may also remember from Section 5 how the text avoids traditional narrative. That structural choice mirrors its theological message. Truth isn't delivered in a story arc. It's discovered in spirals, in patterns, in echoes. That's why the gospel doesn't build to a climax. It unfolds like a scroll that never quite ends. It's a gospel not of conquest, but of coherence. Not of battles won, but of identity recovered. And it leaves you with an unsettling thought. What if nothing outside you can truly save you? What if salvation isn't something coming from the clouds, but a candle already lit in the forgotten chamber of your own soul? And what if the gospel of truth isn't trying to convince you, but to remind you? If someone asked you how to be saved, your answer might depend on your background. Go to church. Believe in Jesus. Repent. Get baptized. Confess. Obey. But in the gospel of truth, the answer is none of these. Or perhaps more unnervingly, it's all of them only if they lead to one thing. Gnosis. Not just knowledge, but knowing. Deep personal cellular recognition. The kind of knowing that doesn't feel like learning, but like waking up from a dream and realizing you've been here before. Salvation in this gospel is not a future reward or a divine transaction. It's not a courtroom verdict. It's the return of memory. It's the sudden clarity that you've never been separate from the divine, except in your own mind. That's the bold core of the gospel of truth, and it lands with the gentleness of a whisper and the weight of a thunderclap. Let's root this in history. The idea of salvation through gnosis was a central pillar of many early Gnostic movements. While mainstream Christian theology emphasized faith in Christ's sacrificial death and participation in church sacraments, Gnostics proposed a radically different framework: that ignorance, not sin, was humanity's core problem. And that salvation was not forgiveness, but illumination. The gospel of truth embodies this perfectly. It describes the world as having fallen into error, a personified, almost sentient force of forgetting. Error isn't evil in the traditional sense. It's not Satan with horns and fire. It's more like spiritual sleep paralysis. It causes fear, confusion, shame. It traps souls in cycles of striving. But the solution is not punishment, not penance. It's recognition. Knowledge. Not external data, but inward alignment. You might remember from Section 8 how the name of the Father isn't a label, but an essence to be remembered. In that same breath, the gospel calls this remembrance salvation. When someone recognizes the Father, they receive the rest. That's a curious phrase. Not they are justified, not they are saved, but they rest. It implies salvation as a return, not an escape. Like climbing back into your own skin after years of exile. The obscure detail here is subtle but profound. The gospel never describes this knowledge as earned. There are no rituals to complete, no moral hoops to jump through. Gnosis is given as grace, but it can only be received by those who are ready. It's like sunlight everywhere but only seen when you open your eyes. This creates a fascinating tension. On one hand, salvation is universal in availability. The text repeatedly speaks of the Father's desire for all things to return to Him. On the other hand, the mechanism of return requires awakening, and not everyone awakens. Some remain in error, not because they're wicked, but because they're still asleep. It's not about damnation, it's about delay. Which brings us to the scholarly debate: is the gospel of truth elitist? Does it imply a spiritual aristocracy, those with gnosis on one side and the oblivious masses on the other? Critics argue that this framework leads to exclusivity, where only the knowers are truly saved. But defenders of the text push back, pointing out that gnosis is presented not as privilege, but invitation. Everyone carries the divine spark. The only difference is who's ready to remember it. And the gospel is gentle with the sleepers. There's no condemnation, no cosmic revenge plot. Instead, it describes the revealer as one who emptied himself so that he might bring the fullness of the Father. He doesn't conquer error. He displaces it. He shows the lie so clearly that it can no longer hold its shape. This Jesus doesn't guilt you into salvation. He reminds you into it. You may recall from section 6 how the poetic structure of the text reflects this very process. Its spirals and refrains mirror the loops of forgetting and remembering. Salvation in this frame isn't a switch. It's a spiral staircase. And every step upward is a piece of yourself coming back into focus. One metaphor stands out in particular. The gospel compares the soul to someone who fell from a great height, lost their way, and forgot where they came from. And Christ, He's the map. Or rather, the echo of home. Not pointing you somewhere else, but inward to the place you left behind, without even noticing. And what about sin? The gospel speaks of it, but not in the fire and brimstone sense. Sin here is not rebellion, it's confusion. The soul sins when it forgets, when it believes the illusion, when it acts out of fear, shame, or desperation because it thinks it is cut off from its source. And the remedy is not punishment, it's understanding. This is where the gospel becomes almost scandalously modern. It reframes salvation as healing. Not judicial healing, not moral rescue, but existential restoration. You are not bad, you are lost. And Jesus isn't a judge. He's the lantern flickering in your fog. That's the good news, as this gospel tells it. The real gospel. Not about blood on an altar, but about light in your memory. About the grace of knowing. About a home that was never taken from you, only misplaced within you. And when you see it, when the name comes back to you, not as a word, but as a recognition, you don't have to fight anymore. You can rest. You can return. Not to a new destination, but to the place you've always been. The place you forgot was yours. You know the story. A shepherd loses one sheep out of 100. He leaves the 99 behind and searches until he finds the lost one. And when he does, he rejoices more over that single stray than over the others who never wandered. It's a favorite parable, short, sweet, theologically tidy. But in the gospel of truth, it's different. The sheep isn't just lost. It's terrified. It has no idea it ever belonged. And when the shepherd finds it, he doesn't scold it. He doesn't rejoice publicly. He quietly whispers into its fear. And suddenly, the sheep remembers. This isn't just a retelling, it's a transformation. The gospel of truth takes one of Jesus's most beloved parables and turns it into a meditation on identity, memory, and spiritual awakening. No longer is the shepherd's journey framed as rescue from danger, it's portrayed as the retrieval of forgotten truth. The sheep wasn't merely lost in geography, it was lost in itself. Let's anchor that in the historical record. In the canonical Gospels, particularly Luke 15, the parable of the lost sheep is about repentance. A sinner returns. A celebration erupts. Everyone's invited. The context is communal. It reinforces the church's mission to bring strays back into the fold. But in the gospel of truth, the same image is rendered more inwardly. Here, the parable becomes less about repentance and more about recognition. The sheep doesn't come back because it's sorry. It comes back because it finally understands that it was never truly apart. The text reads, "He labored even in the loss of the sheep. It was his own. It was not a stranger. He did not act as though it were lost." That line, "he did not act as though it were lost," that's where the temperature shifts. The shepherd never panics. He doesn't blame. He simply moves through the fog knowing that what is his cannot be unmade. Salvation here is not about finding, it's about revealing. And what's revealed is that the sheep belonged all along. You might remember from section 9 how this gospel frames salvation as gnosis, an awakening from error. The reimagined parable deepens that idea. The sheep isn't rescued from wolves, it's freed from forgetting. It had wandered into illusion, into fear. It thought the shepherd was a stranger. It thought the fold was gone. But the shepherd never left. He simply waited until the sheep could hear the sound of its name again. There's an obscure thread woven into this passage, a deliberate softening of judgment. In many early Christian texts, being lost implies rebellion. Here it implies confusion. The shepherd doesn't reprimand. He doesn't tally sins. He sees the sheep trembling and does the one thing that breaks the spell, he embraces it. And in that embrace, the sheep remembers everything. The scholarly debate that follows is subtle but significant. Is this parable a reinterpretation meant to correct the canonical version, or is it a mystical expansion? Some argue that the gospel of truth is reacting against the developing authority structures of the early church, subtly pushing back against the idea of moral repentance enforced by institutional control. Others suggest the author isn't correcting Jesus' words at all, but plumbing them for their deeper interior meaning. Either way, the shift is unmistakable. In the gospel of truth, sin is not rebellion against divine law, it is distance from divine knowledge. The sheep doesn't beg for forgiveness. It doesn't confess. It simply collapses into the arms of the one it thought it had lost, and in doing so realizes it had never left him at all. That change has ripple effects. The emphasis moves away from communal morality and toward inner reconciliation. The shepherd's joy isn't about public spectacle. It's the quiet joy of a parent recognizing their child after a long, dark confusion. No need for punishment, no ritual, just the unspooling of fear in the warmth of familiarity. And then there's the line that slips in like a sigh, "He labored even in the loss." That's not triumph, that's tenderness. That's a God who doesn't fix from afar, but walks into the fog with you. A shepherd who doesn't count sheep as units, but as pieces of himself. You may also recall from section 7 how this gospel portrays Jesus not as a divine fixer, but as a revealer. The shepherd is a perfect mirror of that role. He's not fixing the sheep. He's reminding it. There's no transformation in essence, only in perception. The sheep was never truly other, only unaware. It's a subtle retelling, but a seismic one. It shifts the parable's meaning from "you were bad, now you're back" to "you were confused, now you see." And in that shift, a different kind of hope emerges. Not hope that God will forgive you, but hope that God was never gone, that you were never disqualified, that your forgetting didn't make you unworthy, just in need of remembering. So the shepherd carries the sheep, not out of pity, but because reunion has weight, and memory is heavier than it looks. If you could remember everything, everything you've ever been, everything that's ever held you, what would happen? Would you cry? Would you laugh? Or would you simply sit still, stunned by the quiet realization that you had never been as far from home as you thought? The gospel of truth suggests that all of salvation, all of what we call faith, boils down to a single act: remembering. Not recalling a list of events, not reciting doctrine, but remembering who you are and who you were before the forgetting. This is one of the gospel's most radical ideas, that humanity's tragedy isn't fallenness, but amnesia. We didn't rebel against God. We forgot we belonged. And the voice of Christ, threaded through the text, like a calming presence, isn't shouting judgment. It's whispering names. Names we once knew as our own. Historically, this isn't an isolated thought. Many Gnostic texts describe the soul as having originated in a higher realm close to the divine before being cast or trapped into material existence. But the gospel of truth is less mythological and more psychological. Its emphasis isn't on where you came from, but on what you've forgotten. It doesn't ask, "What sin did you commit?" It asks, "Why are you afraid?" And then, more importantly, do you remember who you are? The gospel paints forgetfulness as a thick cloud, a barrier between the soul and its origin. Error is not active evil, it's disconnection. The kind of dull ache you can't explain. The kind of gnawing sense that something important is missing even when life looks full. And in that emptiness, we build illusions. The text says forgetfulness did not come into being under the Father, although it did come to be because of Him. What comes into being within Him is knowledge. There's the obscure detail. Even error, even forgetfulness, is not cast as evil. It came to be because of Him. Not by divine fault, but by the design of a world in which forgetting leads to longing and longing leads to awakening. This isn't a punishment. It's a process. Like night leading back to morning. You might recall from section 9 how salvation is framed not as a transaction, but as healing. This section deepens that view. Memory in this gospel is the medicine. It is the divine antidote to a world of distraction and self-misunderstanding. And when it returns, when the remembering begins, the soul no longer trembles. It rests. The text uses gentle language to describe this return. It says the soul becomes strong in the Father's rest. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just strong, centered, whole. You are no longer pulled in 10 directions, seeking approval or fearing loss. You are no longer frantically building an identity. You remember you already had one. But here's where the gospel throws its quiet curveball. It suggests that even Jesus had to participate in this pattern of remembering and revealing. He didn't arrive as a static monument of knowledge, but as someone who spoke the hidden things, not invented, not dictated, spoke, like someone drawing a picture already etched in the listener's bones. That's the profound theological implication. Revelation isn't new information. It's ancient memory reawakened. God doesn't give you something foreign. He gives you something familiar, so familiar in fact, that it makes your chest ache a little when it returns. This idea has stirred quiet scholarly controversy. Some argue that it undermines the traditional structure of Christian revelation. If all truth is already inside you, what role does Scripture play? What role does the Church play? But for the author of this gospel, those institutions are not invalidated. They're recontextualized. They are tools, ladders. Their purpose is not to command, but to remind. And when you finally remember, the gospel says you embrace him who is yours. It's such an understated line. Not worship, not fear, embrace. You return to the presence of the divine not as a subject to a king, but as a child to a parent, or perhaps more intimately, as a soul to itself. One metaphor describes the soul as clothing itself in light. Not light it earned, not light it borrowed, its own light rediscovered. That line alone has kept more than one sleepless scholar awake, wondering what it means to carry radiance and not know it. You may also remember from section 10 how the sheep in the reimagined parable wasn't scolded or shamed, but simply held until its fear dissolved. That's the gospel's model for spiritual return. No punishment, no penance, just the soft, sacred shock of memory. And it's not always gentle. Remembering can sting. It means facing all the ways you've lived out of alignment with who you truly are. The ego doesn't give up its illusions easily, but the text offers no threats, only a persistent invitation: come back to yourself. Come back to the place before the fear, before the masks, before the forgetting. So maybe salvation isn't climbing toward something. Maybe it's sinking back into something. A home already built, a truth already given, a name you've always carried even when you forgot how to say it. And when you do remember, truly remember, you won't need proof. You'll feel it in your chest, in your breath, in the strange and sudden stillness of your own being. And you'll know, without needing anyone to confirm it, you've come home. Wait. Where's the agony? Where's the garden of betrayal? The Roman whip, the public humiliation, the nails, the cry of abandonment. Where's the drama of the passion? In the gospel of truth, it's missing. Or rather, it's softened until it barely leaves a ripple. The crucifixion is not denied, but it is de-centered. It doesn't occupy the emotional or theological spotlight. There's no visceral narrative, no step-by-step description of pain, no thunderclouds. Instead, the cross becomes something quieter, less an act of divine punishment, more a moment of unveiling. Less about death, more about disclosure. And that absence is loud. Historically speaking, this omission is startling. By the mid-2nd century, when this gospel was likely written, the crucifixion had already become central to Christian theology. Paul had declared it a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but also the power and wisdom of God. The canonical Gospels built entire chapters around Jesus' trial and execution. Early liturgies centered on his suffering. Martyrs were told to model it. But in the Gospel of Truth, the cross is mentioned once, casually, briefly, almost like a footnote in a cosmic symphony. That mention comes in a passage describing how Jesus was nailed to a tree, but instead of lingering on the violence, the text uses the event as a metaphor. It says it is he who was nailed to a tree and published the edict of the Father on the cross. That's the obscure detail, and it's worth savoring. The cross here is not a place of defeat or even substitution. It is a declaration, a cosmic bulletin board. The crucifixion becomes an announcement not of wrath satisfied, but of truth revealed. You might remember from section 7 how Jesus is presented less as a dying savior and more as a revealer, one who enters error to restore memory. That theme continues here. His death isn't framed as a payment. It's a megaphone, an interruption of illusion, something so jarring, so paradoxically calm in its depiction, that it shifts the focus entirely away from violence. This raises a deeply debated scholarly question: did the author of the Gospel of Truth believe in a literal crucifixion at all? Or was the cross symbolic, an allegorical moment in a larger metaphysical drama? Some argue the Gospel affirms the historic event, just with different emphasis. Others suggest that for this author, the cross was never about blood and nails. It was about the lifting of the veil, the moment where the lie of separation was exposed, where ignorance tried to extinguish the revealer, but instead illuminated him for all to see. That's a bold reinterpretation, and it unsettles traditional theology. Because if Christ's suffering is not the focal point, then atonement, as it's commonly taught, begins to unravel. There's no angry God demanding a sacrifice, no courtroom, no transaction, just a world asleep in error and a messenger whose death isn't a ransom but a reflection of how blind humanity is to its own light. That shift has profound implications. It means that the cross was not necessary to change God's mind. It was necessary to change ours. And it also changes how we think about suffering itself. If Jesus' death isn't portrayed as excruciating, then martyrdom loses its glamour. Pain ceases to be redemptive. The point isn't to bleed for the truth, it's to awaken to it. This approach mirrors what we saw in section 11, the idea of salvation as memory, not merit. The cross in this gospel doesn't save because it hurts. It saves because it speaks. It reveals the deep lie of fear. It shows what error does when it tries to silence light. And it fails. In that way, the cross becomes something very different. Not a transaction, but a turning point. Not a temple altar, but a cosmic wake-up call. And the power lies not in the wood or the nails, but in what was revealed when all illusion cracked open. This view might feel jarring, even disappointing. Where's the drama? The pathos, the tear-stained faces? But the Gospel of Truth isn't interested in catharsis. It's not trying to wring emotion from pain. It wants you calm, present, awake. It wants you to see that the cross was never the end of the story or even the center. It was a hinge, a shift from forgetting to remembering. You may also recall from section 4 how Valentinus, whether as author or influence, prioritized symbolic reading over literalism. This treatment of the cross fits his style perfectly. It's not a denial of the event. It's a reframing, an invitation to look beyond the spectacle into the secret. And maybe that's the deeper challenge of this gospel. It refuses to glorify suffering. It refuses to make pain sacred. Instead, it tells you the truth was never hidden in agony. It was hidden in silence. And silence is what this Jesus breaks, not with a scream, but with a whisper. So yes, the cross appears, but not as torment, as testimony, as the moment the revealer let error do its worst, and still he spoke. What kind of God hides? What kind of divine source, full of light and love and origin, chooses to remain shrouded, unseen, unnamed, unreachable by ordinary thought? In the Gospel of Truth, the Father is not introduced as a king or judge. He's not sitting on a throne. There's no list of attributes, no roaring proclamations. Instead, he is a mystery, a silence, a source so complete that anything which tries to define him only drifts further away. This is one of the central and perhaps most unsettling theological motifs of the Gospel of Truth, that the Father is not just unknowable in degree, he is unknowable in kind. You can't describe him because he exists before language. You can't contain him in thought because thought arises after he's already given you life. He is the silence before the word. And even that metaphor doesn't quite reach him. Historically, this view aligns strongly with the mystical tendencies of the Valentinian school. You may recall from Section 4 how Valentinus drew on Platonic and Pythagorean ideas, imagining God not as a bearded sky deity, but as the pleroma, a fullness too vast to be named, too still to be grasped. This conception of God filtered down into his students, who consistently referred to the Father not as an authority figure, but as the deep well from which all identity flows. But the gospel of truth takes it a step further. It speaks not only of God's unknowability, but of what happens when we forget him. Error arises. Fear takes root. Identity fractures. And yet even in that forgetting, the Father does not punish. He waits, or rather, he is unchanging, undiminished. The text says, "The Father is the one who contains all things within himself like a garden, yet he himself is not known." That's the obscure detail. God is described as a container, but not in the sense of holding power. More like a womb, a source that carries all potential within itself, but remains veiled until the right moment. The gospel resists every attempt to make him manageable. He is not the object of intellectual mastery. He is presence. And if you try to grasp him with the mind, he slips. But if you remember him with the soul, he glows. This leads to an open scholarly debate: is the God of the gospel of truth compatible with the God of mainstream Christianity? Or is he a fundamentally different kind of being, less personal, more metaphysical? Some argue that this gospel leans too far into abstraction, making the Father feel more like a concept than a person. Others counter that it's a return to something deeper, that God in his essence cannot be a person like we are. And to treat him that way is to worship an idol made of language. You might remember from Section 12 how the crucifixion is downplayed, not because it didn't happen, but because it wasn't the point. That same logic applies here. The Father is not hidden because he's withholding. He's hidden because our eyes are too used to light bulbs to see stars. The veil is in us. And yet there is revelation. The word Jesus is called the name of the Father, not just a messenger. He is the name, meaning he makes the unknowable known. He doesn't describe the Father. He embodies the Father's essence in a way that souls wrapped in flesh and fear can begin to perceive. The Gospel uses a striking metaphor: the Father is the root, the Word is the trunk, and the rest of us are branches. Not metaphorically, existentially. To know the Word is to be rejoined to the root, not by theology but by ontological memory. That's the real return the Gospel keeps hinting at, not a journey across space, but a journey inward, past the static and noise, back into the stillness where the root hums. And here's where it gets even more intimate. The Father is hidden not to be mysterious, but to protect the freedom of remembering. The Gospel doesn't say, "You must discover the Father." It says, the Father reveals himself when the time is right, when the soul is ready, when fear has softened, when the lie of separation has been gently exposed. That image of God, patient, gentle, more presence than personality, stands in quiet contrast to the louder gods of punishment and thunder. And yet, for the writer of the Gospel of Truth, it's precisely this silence that makes God beautiful. You may also recall from Section 8 how truth is not taught, but remembered. The hiddenness of the Father fits this model perfectly. He is not absent. He is veiled in the folds of your own being. And every time you love, every time you recognize something eternal beneath the temporary, that veil thins. So what kind of God hides not a cruel one, not a shy one, but a holy one? A God who knows that being found means nothing unless the seeker wants to see. And when you do, when memory returns and the silence becomes a whisper, there is no shock, no explosion, just a stillness, a recognition, and perhaps a smile half formed on your lips because somehow you always knew. Before anything could be spoken, there was silence. Not the silence of boredom or waiting, not the awkward pause of uncertainty. This silence was alive, total, full, the kind of silence that doesn't demand your attention because it already has it. And from that silence came something not separate from it, but shaped by it. The Word. In the Gospel of Truth, the relationship between silence and the Word is not just poetic, it is foundational. The silence is the Father's essence. The Word is His expression. Together they form a divine rhythm presence and echo stillness and sound being and knowing. Historically, this reflects a deep current in both Hellenistic and Jewish mystical thought. You might recall from section 13 that the Father is described as hidden not out of secrecy, but because He transcends all comprehension. He is the source, the pleroma. In Platonic terms, He is beyond being. So how does a being beyond language reveal Himself to beings who only understand language through the Word? This is where the Gospel of Truth offers one of its most elegant theological meditations. The Word, sometimes called the name, the Son, or the fruit, is the means by which the unknowable becomes known. But this is no ordinary speech. The Word doesn't communicate facts. It awakens memory. It is not a sermon. It's a presence. Less instruction, more invitation. The Gospel says the Word came into the midst to speak of the hidden things and to reveal them, not to declare a new system of law, not to threaten, but to illuminate what was already there. Here's an obscure linguistic detail in the Coptic manuscript. The word for word, often rendered logos in the original Greek, carries connotations not just of speech, but of meaning. This isn't a word like table or sun. This is word as meaning made manifest, and its origin, silence. You can almost hear the heartbeat of the text, silence, then word, then remembrance. This raises a rich and ongoing scholarly question. Is this word the same logos described in the Gospel of John, the one that was with God and was God? Some argue yes, that both texts reflect a shared mystical tradition that saw Christ as the bridge between the infinite and the finite. But others note that the Gospel of Truth pushes even further. In John, the Word becomes flesh. Here, the Word becomes memory. He enters the realm of forgetting not simply to take on flesh, but to stir the slumbering soul. His incarnation isn't about blood and bones. It's about resonance. You might also remember from section 6 how the Gospel uses poetic structure to mirror its message. The recurrence of silence and speech, forgetting and remembering stillness and awakening, this isn't just thematic. It's architectural. The entire text moves like breath. Inhale, silence. Exhale, word. The silence is not broken by the word. It is completed by it. That distinction matters. It paints the Father not as withholding, but as patient. His silence isn't absence. It's depth. And the word is not noise, it's the sound of that depth reaching toward you. The Gospel offers a stunning metaphor. The Word is like fruit growing from the silence of the Father's tree. Sweet, natural, inevitable, and nourishing. You don't dissect fruit. You eat it. You taste its truth. And that's what the Word does in this Gospel. He doesn't argue. He nourishes. He doesn't confront error with force, but with recognition. The moment the Word is heard, error begins to tremble. because the illusion of separation cannot survive in the presence of that which was never separate. There's even a moment in the text where the word is described as rest, not as a command to cease striving, but as the experience of being home again. To hear the word is to hear the song beneath all things, the lullaby you forgot you knew. This is where the silence returns, not as absence but as fulfillment. Once the word has done his work, once remembrance blooms again in the soul, silence reclaims its space. But now it's not empty, it's full of knowing. The silence becomes sacred again, not because it hides the truth, but because it has been revealed. That loop, silence, word, remembrance. Silence is the gospel's pulse, and it teaches something few texts dare to say. The divine truth is not a hammer. It's not a blast of certainty. It's a murmur, a resonance. Something you don't so much learn as recognize when everything else goes quiet. You may also recall from section 11 that salvation is portrayed as resting in knowledge. That rest is not passive. It is the return to silence, not a silence of confusion, but of completion. And if the Father is that silence and the Word is His voice, then what are you, the one who hears, the one who remembers, the one who for a long time mistook the noise of error for the music of truth, but now begins to discern the difference? So the Word doesn't shout. He doesn't preach. He speaks softly, like someone waking a beloved from sleep. And in the hush that follows, the silence no longer frightens you, because now you know. The early Christian world was not a single unified choir singing in harmony. It was more like 100 voices rising at once, chanting, whispering, arguing, each convinced it had the true melody. And while many of those voices were eventually tuned into the great composition we now call orthodoxy, some were silenced, or worse, forgotten. The gospel of truth comes from one of those forgotten voices, a voice that didn't shout but hummed quietly of memory and silence, of error and awakening. And the church hated it. You might think that early Christianity welcomed diverse perspectives. After all, the New Testament itself is a patchwork of styles and viewpoints, 4 gospels with differing chronologies, conflicting details, even different last words of Jesus. But by the 2nd century, a new priority emerged: control, doctrine, definition. The desire to draw lines around what counted as true faith and what didn't. And Gnosticism, with its metaphors and mysteries and insistence that knowledge was internal, was too slippery to fence in. The historical anchor here is Irenaeus of Lyons, a bishop in the late 2nd century, who saw himself as a guardian of the apostolic tradition. His massive work against heresies cataloged and condemned the growing number of false teachers threatening to split the church. He named names. He described rituals. He dissected cosmologies with almost sarcastic flair. And among the teachings he targeted most aggressively were those of Valentinus and his followers. You may remember from section 4 how Valentinus nearly became Bishop of Rome, only to be marginalized when his teachings proved too radical. His emphasis on inner awakening, his view of Jesus as a revealer rather than a redeemer, and his multi-layered cosmology all clashed with the emerging framework of one God, one church, one baptism. And the Gospel of Truth, Irenaeus mentions it by name, sort of. He refers to a text circulating among the Valentinians that bears that title, though he doesn't quote it directly. Just the name was enough to provoke suspicion. The Gospel of Truth, as if the others weren't. As if this poetic meditation on memory and silence could supplant the thunderous authority of Matthew or John. That's the heart of the conflict. Gnosis threatened orthodoxy not by denying Jesus, but by redefining him. For the bishops of the church, Jesus had to be a historical event, a body on a cross, a resurrection you could point to. But in the gospel of truth, Jesus is a vibration, a whisper, an invitation to remember something already alive in you. That's not heresy, it's insubordination. Here lies the obscure but crucial detail. The Church's condemnation of Gnosticism wasn't just theological, it was political. In a world where persecution from Rome was real and relentless, unity became a survival strategy. The bishops needed cohesion, a clear creed, a canon, and the Gnostics, writing in riddles, resisting dogma, claiming divine insight, apart from hierarchy, were impossible to pin down. And so the debates sharpened. What counted as scripture? Who had the authority to interpret it? What was the role of faith, of grace, of knowledge? The gospel of truth answers those questions not with statements, but with invitations. It tells you salvation is remembering that Jesus is the revealer of what you already carry, that the Father is hidden but not absent. It doesn't build systems, it builds echoes. You might recall from section 14 how the word emerges from the silence not to declare doctrine, but to awaken awareness. That approach was threatening. Because if truth is found within, who needs bishops? If revelation comes through remembrance, who needs councils and creeds? That's the real heresy of the gospel of truth. Not that it said something obviously false, but that it said something deeply free. And yet, there's a strange tenderness in the text. It doesn't lash out at orthodoxy. It doesn't call names. It doesn't even argue. It simply offers. Like a lantern placed quietly on a path in the dark, trusting that those who are ready will see its light. The voice of the gospel isn't combative. It's compassionate. Even those caught in error aren't condemned, they're described as lost children afraid of a father they don't recognize. Still, compassion didn't save the text from suppression. Over time, the canon closed, the councils ruled, and the gospel of truth, along with dozens of other writings, disappeared. Not burned necessarily, just ignored, silenced, buried. Until a farmer in Egypt cracked open a jar in 1945 and history hiccuped. And that raises the enduring scholarly debate: should we consider texts like this part of Christian history, or something else entirely? Are they early deviations or lost treasures? Is orthodoxy the straight road, or just the one that got paved over? Perhaps the answer is both. Orthodoxy built the cathedral, but Gnosis whispered through the stones, and if you listen closely, even now you can still hear it. Not shouting, not demanding, just humming softly beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. He wasn't subtle, he wasn't gentle, and he certainly wasn't a fan of riddles. Irenaeus of Lyons, the Church's staunchest heresy hunter of the 2nd century, was a man on a mission. His multi-volume work against heresies is as much a theological flamethrower as it is a catalog of everything he found disturbing about the growing diversity of early Christian thought. And near the top of his target list, Valentinus, and by extension, the kind of ideas preserved in the gospel of truth. You might remember from section 15 how orthodoxy and gnosis began to clash in the 2nd century, not only over beliefs, but over authority. Irenaeus saw the Church as a fragile body in need of strong bones, clear doctrine, apostolic succession, a closed canon, and a unified message. Gnostic texts, poetic, cryptic, decentralized, threatened all of that. They suggested that truth wasn't handed down from bishop to bishop, but stirred awake inside the soul. That salvation wasn't obedience, but remembrance. To Irenaeus, that wasn't just theologically wrong, it was dangerous. So he struck. He accused the Gnostics of inventing myths, twisting scripture, using seductive language to lure people away from the rule of faith. He compared their cosmologies to convoluted soap operas involving invisible beings and divine mishaps. He portrayed their leaders, including Valentinus, as wolves in philosophical clothing men, more interested in sounding clever than in preserving truth. And then came the name drop. In Against Heresy's Book 3, Irenaeus mentions a text he calls the Gospel of Truth, likely the same one we've been exploring, though he never quotes it directly. That detail alone is striking. He names it not to engage with it, but to dismiss it. It's a whisper of a condemnation enough to ensure the Gospel's disappearance for 17 centuries. Not by fire, not by sword, but by erasure. This raises a curious scholarly debate. Did Irenaeus actually read the Gospel of Truth, or was he referencing it secondhand? Some argue that he mischaracterized it without understanding its full content. Others suggest he grasped its core message all too well, and that's exactly why he feared it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: Irenaeus didn't argue against nothing. He argued against something beautiful, something thoughtful, something that even if you disagree with it cannot be dismissed as nonsense. The Gospel of Truth doesn't mock Christianity. It reimagines it. And that reimagining was enough to trigger one of the early church's fiercest intellectual defenses. You may recall from section 13 how the Father in this gospel is hidden beyond words, beyond form. That alone challenged the developing orthodoxy, which increasingly favored a God who could be described, structured, even diagrammed. And the Word, as revealer of memory, not moral enforcer, was an affront to the cross-centered salvation narrative Irenaeus fought to defend. To be fair, Irenaeus wasn't acting in a vacuum. His world was fragile. Rome still persecuted Christians. Heresy didn't just threaten ideas, it threatened survival. If the church fractured too early, it might dissolve entirely. And yet, in his passion for unity, Irenaeus may have buried something vital, the possibility that truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it comes wrapped in poetry and paradox. Here's an obscure but telling insight: Irenaeus's tone toward heretics is often paternalistic. He imagines himself as a shepherd guiding confused sheep back to safety. But the Gospel of Truth reverses the image. It's the shepherd. It sees humanity as lost in error, yes, but not because of rebellion. Because of forgetting, and Jesus, so the Gospel says, doesn't demand loyalty. He reminds the soul of its origin. He leads not by fear, but by resonance. That reversal is precisely what made Irenaeus flinch. If truth could be found apart from the church, what role remained for bishops, for councils, for creeds? You might also remember from section 8 how the Gospel claims that truth is not taught, but remembered. That one idea quietly undermines entire institutions. If you already carry what you need to know, then authority becomes guidance, not governance. And Irenaeus could not allow that. So he wrote, and copied, and trained others to guard the borders of belief. His efforts over time shaped the canon-structured orthodoxy and helped define what Christianity would become. He preserved much, but in doing so he also silenced much. And yet, here's the irony: history never tires of the very text he named the Gospel of Truth survived. Not through the official channels, not by ecclesiastical blessing, but buried in a jar hidden by hands that must have known what was coming. And when it resurfaced in 1945, it didn't roar. It whispered. No vengeance, no rebuttal, just presence, just memory. Just the gentle re-emergence of a voice that once stirred fear in the heart of orthodoxy and now stirs longing in those who wonder what else might have been lost. The early church didn't just win the argument it wrote the minutes afterward. It codified the canon, standardized the creeds, and buried the alternatives, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally. The Gospel of Truth was one of those buried things. It didn't die in a fire. It didn't face public trials. It simply faded, disappeared into the hush of heresy lists, its name whispered by bishops who had no intention of quoting it, only warning against it. And yet, it survived. The irony is sharp enough to cut parchment. A gospel about remembering forgotten. A text that tells you truth can't be silenced, sealed in a jar, and hidden for 1700 years, and then unsealed, perfectly preserved at the exact moment modern eyes became curious again. Let's ground that in what we know. You'll remember from Section 2 the 1945 discovery at Nag Hammadi. A red hill in Egypt. A sealed jar. A farmer with a shovel and a little curiosity. Inside, 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts, hymns, treatises, myths, and meditations that had been lost to Christian history. The gospel of truth was among them. Its survival was unlikely. The material papyrus was fragile. The climate, though arid, could have easily ruined it. The scrolls could have been burned, or eaten, or simply torn and forgotten. But they weren't. Someone, perhaps a monk at a nearby monastery, perhaps a follower of the Valentinian tradition, had carefully copied the text into Coptic, stitched it into a codex, wrapped it in leather, and buried it. Not to destroy it, to protect it. This raises a quiet but potent scholarly question: were these texts hidden because they were heretical, or because they were holy? Was it fear of the Church's condemnation that drove their burial, or a deeper reverence, a desire to preserve something luminous that the world wasn't ready for? It's not just speculation. History gives us hints. In 367 CE, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued his famous festal letter, the first known list of the 27 books that would become the New Testament. In it, he warns believers to avoid the apocryphal books, unauthorized, dangerous texts read by heretics. Scholars believe the Nag Hammadi library may have been buried in response to this exact letter. A silent rebellion, not with swords or sermons, but with clay and linen and time. You might recall from section 16 how Irenaeus named the gospel of truth in Against Heresies, not to analyze it, but to banish it. That pattern repeated. The early church didn't always bother refuting Gnostic texts. It simply outlasted them. Suppression didn't require fire, just silence. But the gospel of truth is at its core a text about silence, about hiddenness, about light buried in shadow. So its own disappearance almost feels appropriate, like it was living out its own metaphor. Not erased, just asleep. And when it woke, it didn't demand retribution. It didn't protest the centuries of neglect. It simply glowed again. The text was first translated into English in the late 20th century. Scholars were stunned by its poetic structure, its non-linear theology, its gentle insistence that all things return to the Father not through obedience, but through remembering. For many, it was their first encounter with a Christianity that wasn't about guilt or punishment or debt, but about clarity, identity, a voice calling from within, not without. And it had survived not because it was useful to power structures, but because someone long ago believed it was worth keeping safe. There's an obscure but revealing detail in the manuscript. The final pages of the Gospel of Truth are worn almost as if they'd been touched repeatedly. That's speculative, yes. But imagine someone reading it again and again, letting the final lines imprint themselves on memory. Not to quote in a sermon, but to hold in the soul. Not doctrine, but devotion. This survival is part of a broader pattern. Many Gnostic texts re-emerged in the modern era not through church archives but through chance, through ruins, through farmers, smugglers, accidents, as if history, like the soul, occasionally remembers what it once tried to forget. And with their return comes a quiet reckoning. What else did we lose? What other visions of Christ were never canonized? What whispers of the divine were dismissed because they didn't shout loudly enough to be heard over the sound of dogma? You may also recall from section 10 how the parable of the lost sheep was retold, not as a rescue from danger, but as the return of a trembling soul to a truth it had always known. That's what happened to this gospel. It was the lost sheep. And now it returns not to be crowned, not to replace, but simply to be embraced again. Not because it solves every theological debate, but because it refuses to stop asking the one question that still lingers: have you remembered? What if the gospel got him wrong, not entirely, not maliciously, but just not deeply enough? That's the question hovering beneath the surface of the gospel of truth, a text that doesn't reject Jesus but reimagines him, not as a sacrifice, not as a miracle worker, but as a mirror. Not a savior who fixes what's broken, but a revealer who shows you that you were never broken to begin with, only unaware. In this gospel, Jesus is not a problem solver. He is a remembering agent, a presence so clear, so full of recognition, that he reflects your true nature back to you. And when you see it, when you really see it, you don't just believe in him. You remember yourself. Let's be precise. The historical Jesus of the canonical Gospels is complex teacher-healer, exorcist, provocateur. But by the time the New Testament was canonized, his role had narrowed. He became primarily the lamb, the ransom, the necessary payment to satisfy divine justice. That image, powerful as it is, casts humanity in a particular role, guilty, fallen, in debt. The gospel of truth gently tears that script in half. It presents Jesus not as a transaction, but as a transmitter. He doesn't die to change God's mind. He lives to change yours. His purpose isn't to redirect divine wrath. It's to dissolve your illusions. You might remember from section 6 how the gospel's language is poetic, recursive, almost meditative. That style is central to its reimagining of Jesus. It doesn't explain him. It experiences him. It refers to him not by name, but by function, the word, the name, the fruit of the Father's heart. These aren't titles, they're roles. And each one points toward what Jesus does not, what he proves. The obscure detail here is tucked into one of the Gospel's quieter phrases. It calls the revealer the fragrance of the Father. Not the hammer, not the sword, the fragrance. Something that lingers, that can't be seen but fills the space with presence. That image alone reshapes everything. Jesus isn't there to overpower you. He's there to stir you, to move you toward a kind of inner recognition that smells like home. And here's where the scholarly debate gets interesting. Is this version of Jesus compatible with orthodox Christianity, or is it something else entirely? Some argue that this portrayal is simply mystical, emphasizing spiritual awakening over historical event. Others claim it crosses a theological line, reducing Jesus to metaphor. But the gospel of truth never denies his incarnation. It simply focuses on what that incarnation means. Not as a forensic solution to sin, but as a lamp in the fog of forgetting. It's not that Jesus didn't suffer. It's that his suffering isn't the point. His being is. You may also recall from section 12 how the crucifixion in this gospel is framed not as an act of atonement, but as an unveiling. It was the moment when the world, lost in error, tried to silence the revealer and failed. The cross doesn't redeem. It reveals the nature of the illusion. That violence cannot erase truth. That death cannot touch what was never born. This view reframes everything: faith, forgiveness, even the nature of discipleship. To follow Jesus in this gospel is not to mimic his deeds or recite his teachings. It's to realize what he realized. that the Father is not far, that error is not your identity, that fear is not your name. This is not a Jesus who builds churches. It's a Jesus who dissolves walls, who walks into locked rooms and breathes peace instead of doctrine, who doesn't ask, "Do you believe?" but instead asks, "Do you remember?" And the remembering isn't just emotional, it's ontological. It shakes your being. The Gospel says that when you know the Father through the Word, you become His voice, His rest, His fullness, not a worshiper at a distance, but a participant in divine life. This notion echoes Valentinian theology, which you encountered back in section 4. For Valentinus and his followers, Jesus was not simply the Son of God. He was the blueprint of restored humanity, the archetype of what it means to be awake in a world of sleepwalkers. And that awakening wasn't exclusive. It was invitational. And that's the most radical thing about this gospel. It doesn't just reframe Jesus. It reframes you. You are not a sinner trying to earn grace. You are a spark trying to shake off the ash of error. You are not on probation awaiting judgment. You are on pilgrimage returning to yourself. And Jesus, He is not the gatekeeper. He is the gentle voice behind the door. The one who knocks not with force, but with recognition. The one who reminds you that the light you seek has always been burning. Inside. Imagine assembling a library that would define salvation. That's what the early church was doing in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, deciding which books would be sacred and which would be shelved, ignored, or buried. It wasn't a clean process. It wasn't quick. And it certainly wasn't free of politics. But by the end of it, the canon of the New Testament stood like a carefully constructed wall, and the gospel of truth was left standing on the outside looking in. Why would a gospel that speaks so gently, so poetically, so reverently about Christ be excluded? It never mocks Jesus, never contradicts Him outright. It simply whispers a different vision, a vision that frightened those who believed salvation should come through the church, not through an awakening within. The historical fact is this: the gospel of truth was never officially declared heretical by a council. It was simply not included, omitted, quietly passed over in favor of texts that offered clearer doctrine, stronger institutional alignment, and frankly, more control. You might remember from section 16 how Irenaeus of Lyons struck the first major blow. In Against Heresies, he named the gospel of truth, lumping it with Valentinian teachings he saw as dangerous, elitist, and destabilizing. He didn't quote it. He didn't argue against its points. He simply labeled it heresy and moved on. That label stuck. Over time, the church solidified what counted as apostolic teaching. It favored texts attributed to known disciples' books that fit a coherent theology of sin, grace, judgment, and resurrection. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John told stories that could be taught to growing congregations. Paul's letters provided structure and correction. Revelation terrified everyone into obedience, which had its uses. But the gospel of truth, it was abstract, circular. It offered no historical details about Jesus' life, no virgin birth, no feeding of the 5,000, no trial, no tomb, no visible resurrection, just metaphors, memory, a truth so inward that no altar could contain it. Here lies the obscure but critical detail: the gospel refers to the gospel of truth, not as a book, but as a state of awareness. It's not something you read. It's something you receive when you're ready. A state of joy that comes from remembering the Father, and by extension, yourself. And that was the problem. The emerging church needed a public faith, one with lines, with authority, with rituals that could be performed and roles that could be assigned. The gospel of truth taught that the deepest truths didn't come from outside, from creeds or councils, but from within, from gnosis. That internal model undermined institutional power. If the divine was already inside you, what need had you for priests? If the revealer simply triggered memory, what role remained for doctrine? You may recall from section 17 how the gospel survived not through ecclesiastical approval, but through secrecy and soil. It wasn't lost because it was hated. It was lost because it was ignored, too soft to fight, too inward to lead armies, too free to canonize. The scholarly debate continues today. Some argue that the gospel of truth was simply too difficult to teach, too symbolic. Others claim it threatened the social order by decentralizing authority, rejecting substitutionary atonement, and redefining Jesus as revealer rather than redeemer. And then there's the possibility, soft haunting, that the church simply didn't know what to do with it. It didn't say the wrong things. It said things too differently. No lists, no rules, no tidy categories, just memory poetry, and a Christ who reminds rather than demands. That's what made it dangerous. Not that it denied the gospel, but that it asked, what if the real gospel isn't a book at all? What if it's something inside you waiting to be remembered? What if the word doesn't tell you what to believe but who you are? That kind of gospel can't be canonized. It can only be found. Which is exactly what happened. At first, it feels like drifting. The gospel of truth doesn't move in a straight line. It doesn't have chapters. It doesn't tell stories. It doesn't present arguments in the way modern readers expect. It folds in on itself. It repeats phrases. It circles loops and lingers. You may find yourself rereading the same paragraph multiple times, not because it's unclear, but because it almost seems to change shape each time you return. But this isn't disorder. It's design. Beneath the surface of this poetic text lies a deliberate structure, subtle, meditative, and rhetorical, in a way that mirrors the very message it seeks to convey. And if you look closely, you'll find a rhythm. Not a roadmap exactly, but a spiral staircase winding toward revelation. Let's start with the historical framework. Scholars studying the Coptic version of the Gospel of Truth, likely translated from a lost Greek original, have noted several structural devices embedded in the text. Chief among them is ring composition, a literary form used in ancient texts from the Hebrew Bible to Homer. In ring composition, themes are introduced, explored, then returned, to creating a mirror effect that draws attention to the center point of the work. In this gospel, that central point is gnosis, not just knowledge, but remembrance. The opening speaks of forgetfulness, the descent into error, the wandering of souls. Then gradually the tone shifts toward revelation, toward return, toward the rest that comes with knowing the Father. Finally, the text loops back, echoing themes from the beginning, but now through the lens of someone who has remembered. It is not a linear arc. It is a spiral of deepening understanding. You might recall from section 14 how the Gospel describes the Word as emerging from silence. That silence is not only a theological concept, it is also a structural one. Moments of pause, of unresolved thought are left hanging intentionally. Not everything is explained. The text breathes. And in those breaths, the reader is invited not to consume meaning, but to experience it. Here's an obscure rhetorical technique worth noting. The text frequently uses anaphora, repetition of phrases at the beginning of clauses or sentences. Phrases like the Father, the Word, the name, the error, they return again and again, creating not only rhythm, but a kind of spiritual hypnosis. It's not didactic, it's incantatory. You're not just reading, you're being drawn into a state that scholars argue was likely intentional. This gospel may have been composed not as a treatise to be debated, but as a text to be read aloud, slowly, meditatively. Perhaps in a gathering of initiates, perhaps during a ritual of remembering. This leads to an open debate: was the gospel of truth meant for public consumption or private contemplation? Its lyrical structure suggests the latter. It's not trying to convince, it's trying to resonate, and resonance requires rhythm. The gospel's internal structure is also steeped in contrast: knowing versus forgetting, light versus shadow, error versus truth. But these opposites are never placed in binary conflict. They flow into each other the way shadow clings to the edges of light. Error is not evil, it's confused. Forgetting is not failure, it's sleep. And truth doesn't arrive as a sword, it unfolds like a sunrise. This gentle contrast underpins the structural movement of the text. You aren't led from bad to good or lost to found. You are walked in circles until you begin to see the pattern. And when you do, something inside starts to realign, not because you've memorized a doctrine, but because the shape of the message has shifted the shape of your seeing. You may remember from section 18 how this gospel reimagines Jesus not as a sacrifice but as a revealer. That same principle shapes the text itself. It doesn't teach, it reveals. It is less like a gospel and more like a mirror polished with words. One metaphor in the text speaks of people wandering in a fog, not knowing where they came from. But when the revealer comes, he sheds light on the path, not by building a road, but by illuminating where the path has always been. The gospel works the same way. It doesn't construct a new system. It uncovers what was already inside you, buried beneath layers of noise. There's a moment, subtle, easily missed, where the gospel compares truth to a fragrance. Something that enters you without asking permission. That's what the structure does. It lingers. It seeps. You don't walk away with bullet points. You walk away feeling like something has shifted, even if you can't explain what. And maybe that's the point. In a tradition where gospels are usually about events, this one is about experience. Where others describe what Jesus did, this one unfolds what Jesus meant. Not historically, existentially. The structure reflects that shift. And when you finish, you don't feel like you've reached a conclusion. You feel like you've returned, not to a belief, but to a memory. It's strange, isn't it, to open a gospel and find no threats, no fire, no gnashing of teeth, no angry deity looming behind the clouds, tallying your failures with divine indifference. Instead, the gospel of truth presents something gentler, almost shockingly so. Truth doesn't descend with wrath. It doesn't split the sky with thunder. It arrives like balm on a bruise, quiet, soothing, and most unexpectedly, healing. This is perhaps the most radical inversion of the gospel of truth, its redefinition of salvation, not as pardon from guilt, but as recovery from injury. The soul isn't criminal, it's wounded. Truth isn't judgment, it's medicine. You might remember from section 9 how the gospel introduced salvation as a process of remembering. That theme deepens here. It's not just memory for memory's sake, it's restoration. And truth, real truth, is not a doctrinal statement, but a healing presence. Something that recognizes your pain without flinching and then slowly dissolves it wordlessly like dawn melts fog. The text says, "The word went to error with the intent that he might bring back the lost, enlighten them, and give them a place in the Father's rest." There's no courtroom here. No cosmic judge in robes and thunder. Just light walking into darkness, not to accuse it, but to dissolve it. And that's the obscure detail many readers miss. Error isn't just wrongness. In this gospel, error is almost a character, a presence that causes forgetting, confusion, fragmentation. But error is not evil in the classical sense. It's more like a disorienting illness. And the word, he's not a prosecutor. He's a physician. This soft reframing unsettles traditional theology. It removes the tension of divine wrath. It challenges the foundational assumption that humanity is guilty by default, and instead it introduces a subtle but seismic shift. What if the soul is not condemned, but simply injured by ignorance? What if healing begins not with punishment, but with clarity? That's the beating heart of the gospel of truth. Truth isn't something to weaponize, it's something to receive, not a command, a remedy. This leads to a lively, scholarly debate. Some argue that this gospel lacks moral weight, that by replacing sin with forgetfulness, it downplays human responsibility. Others counter that it doesn't erase moral action, it simply repositions it. In this view, harmful behavior stems not from rebellion, but from unawareness, from living out of a false identity. And the healing offered by truth isn't indulgence, it's transformation. You may also recall from section 11 how memory itself becomes the act of salvation. Here, that memory is not cold recollection, it's integration. The broken parts of the self, scattered by fear and error, are gathered again in the embrace of truth. There's no punishment, just return. Just the soul remembering its own name after years of trying on masks. And this healing is not transactional. It's not bought with sacrifice. It's not bartered through ritual. It's received like sunlight on skin. The gospel says that when the soul recognizes the Father, it finds rest. Not obedience, not reward. Rest. That rest is not the end of striving. It's the end of fear. And in a world where religion often makes fear the engine of faith, this gospel quietly cuts the cord. Another metaphor in the text describes truth as a fragrance that draws the lost soul home. Again, we see the tone, not command, but invitation. Not judgment, but presence. Not correction, but healing. That's what makes this gospel feel so startlingly modern. Its approach to spirituality aligns less with courtrooms and more with therapy, less with shame, more with self-awareness. It views the divine not as a punishing parent, but as a quiet inner knowing you've been taught to ignore. But perhaps the most moving line in the text, one that encapsulates this healing vision, is simple: they knew not the Father, for they were afraid. That's the root of error. Not pride, not malice, fear. And truth does not defeat fear with threats. It defeats it by disappearing it. Truth in this gospel is the moment when the lights come on and the monsters in the room turn out to be coats and furniture. It is the return of proportion, of clarity, of reality not as judgment, but as embrace. And this isn't cheap comfort. It's not sentimentality. It's a theology of tenderness, one that sees spiritual wounds not as failures, but as opportunities for reunion. Jesus doesn't wield truth like a sword. He carries it like a lantern, one step at a time, toward wholeness. You may also remember from section 19 how the canon left this gospel out, and perhaps this is why. A gospel that heals instead of rules, that quiets instead of commands, that places the center of salvation not in obedience, but in inward restoration. That kind of gospel doesn't build empires, it builds peace. Imagine the universe not as a battlefield between good and evil, but as a dream. A long, thick, aching dream in which every soul has forgotten its name. In this dream, we build cities and systems, start wars and religions, all while carrying a faint, nagging sense that something is missing. Not something material, something essential. And no matter how hard we strive, there's a low hum of dislocation, like waking up in a room that looks familiar but isn't home. The gospel of truth suggests that this is not a metaphor, it is the story. A cosmic drama in which forgetfulness is not a side effect, it's the plot. And error, the near personified force that governs this forgetfulness, isn't evil in the classical sense. It's not demonic, it's disoriented. A fog that thinks it's a map. A whisper that says you're alone when you're not. You might remember from Section 3 how Gnosticism describes the material world as flawed, even illusory, crafted not by the highest God, but by a lower power unaware of the fullness. The gospel of truth picks up that thread and weaves it into a tapestry of yearning. The world it implies is not evil. It is confused. Error isn't sin in the judicial sense, it's distortion. And humanity's core issue isn't rebellion, it's amnesia. This gospel's cosmology unfolds like a layered myth. The Father exists in stillness beyond time and division. From him emanates the Word, the Revealer, who enters the world of error not to destroy it, but to dispel it. He is the sound that breaks the silence, the whisper that cracks the mirror. And when he speaks, those with ears to hear begin to remember not facts, but identity. Here's an obscure passage that captures this beautifully. Since forgetfulness came into being because the Father was not known, therefore, if the Father comes to be known, forgetfulness will cease to be. That's the solution. Not punishment, not purification, recognition. The soul doesn't need to be fixed, it needs to be awakened. This leads to a rich scholarly conversation. Some argue the Gospel's cosmology is too abstract, too mythological to be coherent. Others see in its layered metaphors a deeply psychological truth, that spiritual alienation is a condition of disconnection, not depravity. And that reconnection-reunion is not earned but remembered. The drama of forgetfulness isn't linear. It doesn't move from point A to point B. It spirals. People wake and sleep again. They glimpse truth and retreat. They hear their name and then doubt it. The gospel mirrors this. Its structure, as we saw in Section 20, isn't narrative, it's recursive, like the mind trying to trace the outline of a half-remembered dream. And that dream isn't just individual, it's cosmic. The gospel implies that all of creation groans under the weight of this sleep. That the Word descended into the fog not to perform magic tricks or die for sins, but to inject meaning back into the fractured system. To drop a thread into the maze. Not as an escape rope, but as a memory trigger. You may recall from Section 13 how the Father is hidden not because he's distant, but because our eyes are veiled. This section explains why. Error teaches us to fear, to doubt, to perform. And those performances become identities. But deep under the costumes, the gospel says is a spark, a stillness, a knowing. And when you touch it, the fog begins to lift. That's the gospel's view of salvation. Not a one-time event, but a cosmic unfolding. As more souls remember, as more light pierces the shadow, the drama turns. The dream thins. The Word is not merely Jesus. It is the pattern of revelation itself, present wherever memory returns. And the cross, as seen in Section 12, it's not the climax of pain, but the rupture of illusion. The moment when error's script collapses under the weight of unveiled truth. The Word doesn't win by conquering. He reorients everything, and that reorientation is contagious. There's a metaphor near the end of the Gospel where the Revealer is described as a fragrance of rest. Not a command, not a thunderclap. A fragrance. The implication is subtle but profound. Awakening doesn't come through pressure, but through recognition. A smell that reminds you of home. A word that unlocks something in your chest. a moment of stillness that breaks the spell. The cosmic drama, then, is not about heaven and hell. It's about sleeping and waking, about remembering who you were before fear told you otherwise, about realizing the word is not somewhere else but inside you waiting. And once you begin to remember, even if only faintly, error begins to collapse. The fog cannot hold when the spark ignites, and the drama, it begins to end. Not with applause, but with quiet. 17 centuries after it vanished beneath Egyptian sands, the gospel of truth returned, not to pulpits, not to canon, but to curiosity. It didn't scream for attention. It didn't demand belief. It simply appeared. A voice from the 2nd century whispering into the 21st. And astonishingly, people listened. Because even across that chasm of time, something in its cadence still resonates. Maybe more now than ever. Why? Because ours is a world drenched in information, but parched for meaning. We have endless data, infinite opinions, doctrines in abundance. But clarity, stillness, inner knowing, those are harder to come by. And the gospel of truth, with all its swirling metaphors and refusal to impose, offers something rare, not answers, but a space in which better questions might arise. You might remember from section 21 how this gospel redefined truth as healing, not doctrine, not decree, but presence. That's a truth that fits oddly well in an age where so many are burnt out on systems, institutions, and inherited dogma. It doesn't try to convert. It tries to reorient. It doesn't say, "Follow me." It says, "Wake up." That quiet invitation, "Wake up," is perhaps why this text speaks to modern readers across spiritual backgrounds. It doesn't rely on exclusivity. It doesn't insist that it's the only way. In fact, it seems to resist that kind of rigidity altogether. Its Jesus isn't defending turf. He's turning on lights. And in that light, modern seekers find a strangely familiar echo, that beneath the anxiety, the overthinking, the religious baggage, there is something whole, something still, something that hasn't been lost, only forgotten. Here's the obscure thread that ties the ancient to the now, the gospel's obsession with memory. Not historical memory, but existential memory. That deeper sense of having come from something eternal, something peaceful, something you didn't earn because you already are it. This idea has quietly crept into modern spirituality, psychology, even self-help. The notion that healing is not the acquisition of something new, but the reintegration of what was always yours. That the truth isn't external, it's internal. That the journey isn't forward, it's inward. The gospel of truth got there long before the rest of us. There's a growing scholarly movement that sees Gnostic texts not as mistakes of history, but as alternate lenses, views that might enrich rather than undermine traditional faith. These aren't heresies. They're hymns in a different key, and among them, the gospel of truth stands out for its tone. It doesn't rail, it doesn't rage. It simply offers a vision of Jesus that modern readers find strangely familiar. Not the cosmic enforcer, not the doctrinal divider, but the quiet voice in the center of your storm reminding you were never separate. You may also recall from section 18 how this gospel reimagines Jesus not as a fixer but a revealer. That interpretation has begun to gain traction, not just in fringe circles, but in broader theological discussions. The idea that Christ's mission is not to change God's posture toward you, but to awaken your posture toward God. That changes everything. Even the church has started to take notice. Not all, of course. But some theologians and contemplative writers have begun citing Gnostic wisdom, especially this gospel, as a kind of contemplative companion to canonical scripture. not to replace it, to deepen it. And for those burned by religion, the gospel of truth offers a rare balm, a spirituality not rooted in fear but in forgetting, not in guilt but in grace. A path that doesn't demand perfection but invites recognition. It doesn't ask you to agree, it asks you to remember. That memory might come in silence, in music, in sudden tears, in a long-forgotten dream, in the moment you realize you've spent years searching for something you already carry inside. And that's the final resonance this gospel doesn't preach to you. It sits with you. It knows you're tired. It knows you've been chasing God through rituals and doctrines and disciplines and doubts. And it doesn't say stop. It says pause. Listen. Do you hear it? Not outside. Inside. The faint hum, the unforgotten name. The stillness that says you've been home all along. If you've come this far, it's probably not because you were looking for one more dusty scroll or one more fringe theology. You're here because something in the gospel of truth doesn't feel like history. It feels personal. It's not just a story about a figure named Jesus. It's a story about how you recognize yourself in him. So now, 23 chapters later, it's time to return to the question that started all this. What exactly does this gospel reveal about Jesus, not Jesus the carpenter? Not Jesus the prophet? Not even Jesus the crucified Savior? This text introduces us to a version of Christ that is more like a whisper than a figure, a presence, a revealer, a crack in the wall of our illusions through which the light of recognition pours. You might remember back in section 6 when we first explored the portrait of Jesus as he appears in this gospel. There's no Bethlehem, no manger, no nativity, no walking on water or multiplying loaves, no trial before Pilate, no resurrection account. It isn't that those things are denied, they're just irrelevant. What matters here is what Jesus reveals, not what he did. And what he reveals, according to this text, is not a new religion. It's a forgotten relationship. He is, in the words of the gospel, the knowledge of the Father. Not a substitute, not an emissary, not even a prophet. He is the pattern by which knowing becomes possible again. And that knowing gnosis is not factual, not theological. It's immediate, intimate. Like remembering your mother's voice after years of silence. That's what makes this gospel feel so different. It doesn't talk about Jesus. It lets him resonate like a tuning fork struck in the heart. His message isn't "follow me to heaven." It's "you've never left." He doesn't come to fix the soul. He comes to show it what it is. Scholars have long debated whether this text refers to a historical Jesus or a purely symbolic Christ. The lines are blurred deliberately so. It's less biography, more mirror. Less event, more unveiling. But the power of this gospel lies in the way it refuses to separate Jesus from the truth he reveals. He is the revelation because through him you remember yourself as something unbroken. This Christ is not heroic in the conventional sense. He's not battling enemies. He's dissolving illusions. You might recall from section 12 how the crucifixion is barely mentioned, because the real sacrifice here is not blood, but silence broken. The Word entering the world of error, not to argue but to wake. And what does he awaken? A memory older than doctrine. A light buried beneath layers of fear, shame, and inherited theology. The gospel of truth doesn't claim to give you that memory. It just wants you to feel the ache of its absence. And once you feel that, it begins to return. There's a curious passage midway through the gospel where Jesus is described not as one who speaks, but one who is spoken through. He is the mouthpiece of the unutterable, the language of the unknowable. That's a deeply mystical vision, one that resonates today with contemplative Christians, spiritual seekers, even some therapists. He doesn't impose truth, he evokes it. And that evocation is contagious. It spreads like a scent you didn't know you missed, a word you've forgotten in your own tongue, a pause that says, "This is safe. You can remember now." So what does this gospel really tell us about Jesus, that he is not a doctrine to believe in? He is the whisper that says, "You're not lost. You've just forgotten." That he is not a demand for obedience. He is the reminder that nothing true can be taken from you. That he is not a transaction between heaven and earth. He is the stillness in which heaven was never separate to begin with. More than any creed, this gospel invites you to sit in that stillness and listen. To remember not the events of one man's life 2,000 years ago, but the pattern of return, the secret song sung in your bones, the Jesus who is not over there but here and always was. And maybe that's why this text was hidden for so long. Not because it was dangerous in the usual way, but because it asks something more subversive than belief. It asks you to wake up and to remember that you never really fell asleep alone. So now you've heard it, not in full, not line by line, but in spirit. A gospel buried then found, a message dismissed, yet echoing still. And the question lingers like the last flicker of candlelight in a quiet room: is humanity finally ready to hear it? The gospel of truth was never meant for easy consumption. It offers no creeds, no checklists, no final triumph. Instead, it hums with something far more unsettling, the idea that the truth is not missing, it's merely misremembered. And remembering it, well, that might change everything. But even now that remembering is fragile. The scroll that held this teaching lay hidden in a jar for over 1,600 years. Not burned, not destroyed, just forgotten. What does it say about us that when truth doesn't fit our stories, we so easily lose track of it? And yet maybe that's not failure. Maybe that's the pattern. Because remembering, like healing, comes slowly, quietly, at night, in dreams, in stories, in whispers like this one. So breathe easy now. Let your thoughts settle. Let the questions go unanswered for just a moment. You don't need to hold on to every word. You don't need to chase every mystery. It's enough to know that not all gospels were lost by accident. Some were hidden for the right moment, and some were waiting for you.